"Get up, preacher, or I swear I'll bury you where you kneel." The voice was a low growl, cutting through the dry desert wind like a blade through canvas. It came from a shadow standing against the crimson horizon, where the sun bled into the dunes of the Nevada wasteland. Reverend Jonah Cade froze, his knees pressed into the cracked earth, his hands still clutching the worn leather Bible he'd been reading aloud to no one but the wind. The air smelled of dust and gunpowder, and the weight of the stranger's words pressed against his chest heavier than the heat of the dying day. Jonah hadn't heard the man approach. Not the crunch of boots, not the creak of leather, not even the soft snort of a horse. One moment he'd been alone, whispering psalms to the empty expanse of sand and sagebrush, and the next, this figure loomed over him, a silhouette framed by the fading light, a revolver glinting in one hand, its barrel catching the last rays like a shard of broken glass. Jonah's heart thudded, not from fear but from something older, something he'd buried deep in the decade since he'd last seen blood on his hands. He raised his eyes slowly, squinting against the glare. The stranger's face was half hidden by a weathered hat, but the eyes beneath it burned with a purpose that made Jonah's stomach twist. "Who are you?" Jonah's voice was steady, though his throat felt like it was lined with gravel. He'd faced death before, started down in alleys, saloons, and churchyards, but this was different. This man wasn't here for money or revenge. He was here for something Jonah couldn't yet name. The stranger tilted his head, the brim of his hat casting a shadow across his jaw. "Name's not important. What matters is you're out here, alone, praying to a God who don't seem to be listening. Makes me wonder what kind of man you are, preacher." He stepped closer, boots kicking up small clouds of dust that shimmered in the twilight. "Makes me wonder what you're running from." Jonah's fingers tightened around the Bible, its edges worn soft from years of handling. He wasn't running. Not anymore. 10 years ago, he'd walked away from a life of violence, trading a gun for a cross and a badge for a collar. He'd built a quiet existence in this nowhere corner of the territory, a place so forgotten even the vultures seemed to pass it by. His small church, little more than a shack with a crooked steeple, stood a mile back, its walls baked by the sun and its pews empty save for the ghosts of his past. He came out here to the dunes to pray, because it was the only place he could hear himself think, the only place the memories of gunshots and betrayal didn't follow. "I'm not running," Jonah said, rising slowly to his feet, brushing the sand from his black coat. "And I don't know you, so either tell me what you want or pull that trigger. I've got no patience for games." The stranger's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to make Jonah's skin prickle. "No games, preacher. Just a message." He reached into his coat, slow enough to show he wasn't drawing another weapon, and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased. He tossed it at Jonah's feet, where it landed with a soft thud in the dirt. Found it pinned to a body in red hollow. Man was gutted like a deer, left to bleed out under the stars. This was all he had left. Jonah's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to the stranger. His pulse quickened, but he didn't move to pick it up. "Why bring it to me?" "Because your name's on it." The stranger's voice was flat, final, like the slam of a coffin lid. "And because whoever wrote it wants you to know they're coming." The desert seemed to hold its breath. The wind died, leaving only the faint hum of heat rising from the ground. Jonah's past was a locked door he'd nailed shut years ago, but now it felt like someone was prying at the hinges. He knelt, keeping his eyes on the stranger, and picked up the paper. It was brittle, stained with what looked like dried blood. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers steady despite the weight of the stranger's gaze. Scrawled in a hurried, jagged hand were 3 words, "Jonah Cade." Soon, below them, a crude drawing of a noose, its lines smudged but unmistakable. Jonah's chest tightened, not with fear but with recognition. He'd seen this handwriting before, in a different life, on a different piece of pepperoni that had cost him everything. The memory hit like a bullet, a woman's scream, a man's laughter, the metallic tang of blood in the air. He shoved it down, locking it back where it belonged. "Who gave you this?" Jonah asked, his voice low, dangerous. The stranger shrugged, holstering his revolver with a fluid motion. "Didn't say. Just told me to find the preacher in the desert and make sure he got it. Paid me enough to make it worth the ride." He turned, as if to leave, then paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "One more thing, Cade. Whoever's coming for you, they ain't the forgiving kind. I'd sleep with one eye open if I were you." And then he was gone, melting into the dusk as silently as he'd appeared, leaving Jonah alone with the paper and the weight of a past he'd thought was dead. He stood there for a long time, the Bible heavy in one hand, the note burning in the other. The desert stretched out around him, vast and indifferent, but for the first time in years, it felt too small to hide him. By the time Jonah reached his church, the stars were out, sharp as knife points against the black sky. The building was a humble thing, its wooden walls warped by years of heat and neglect, its steeple leaning like a drunk against the wind. Inside, a single lantern cast flickering shadows across the pews, where dust had settled like a congregation that never left. He set the Bible on the altar, next to a tin cup and a half-empty bottle of whiskey he hadn't touched in months. The note, though, he kept in his hand, as if letting it go would make the threat it carried more real. He sat in the front pew, staring at the paper, rereading those 3 words until they blurred. Jonah Cade. Soon. The noose drawing was sloppy, but it wasn't the work of an amateur. It was deliberate, a promise carved in ink. He knew who'd written it, or at least, he suspected. Elias Kane. The name alone was enough to make his blood run cold, a name tied to the worst day of his life, the day he'd lost everything that made him human. 10 years ago, Jonah had been a deputy in Copper Creek, a town that thrived on silver and sin. He'd been good at his job, too good, some said. He'd taken down outlaws, broken up bar fights, and walked the line. Line with ease. But the past doesn't let go that easily, and neither does Elias Kane. The desert night was quiet, save for the distant howl of a coyote. But Jonah's mind was anything but. He hadn't spoken Elias's name aloud in years, hadn't let himself think of it for more than a fleeting moment, before shoving it back into the dark corners of his memory. Elias Kane was a ghost, a shadow from a life Jonah had burned to the ground and walked away from. A man with a smile like a wolf's and a heart blacker than coal. A man who'd once called Jonah friend, partner, brother in arms until the day he'd betrayed everything they'd stood for. Jonah had been a deputy, and Elias his partner. The two of them an unstoppable force in Copper Creek. They'd ridden together, fought together, bled together. Jonah had trusted Elias with his life, had believed in the bond they'd forged through years of facing down outlaws and cleaning up a town that reeked of corruption. But Elias had a hunger Jonah hadn't seen, a greed that went deeper than money, power, control, the kind of man who'd sell his soul for a taste of it. It had all come apart in a single night. A raid gone wrong, a trap set by men they were supposed to trust. Jonah's wife, Abigail, had been caught in the crossfire, a civilian casualty in a war they hadn't known they were fighting. Elias had been there, his gun still smoking, when Jonah found her body in the street. Her eyes open and unseeing, her blood pooling beneath her like spilled wine. He'd sworn it was an accident, that the bullet wasn't meant for her. But Jonah had seen the truth in his eyes. Elias had been bought, paid for by the same men they'd sworn to bring down. The betrayal cut deeper than the loss. Though both had carved pieces of Jonah's soul he'd never get back. He'd walked away from Copper Creek that night, leaving his badge in the dust and his heart in the grave. Elias had disappeared, too, vanishing into the underbelly of the territory's criminal world, leaving behind only rumors and bodies. Jonah had spent a decade convincing himself Elias was gone for good, dead, imprisoned, or lost to some far-off hellhole. But the note in his hand said otherwise. Jonah Cade. Soon. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise, and Elias Kane kept his promises. Jonah stood, the creak of the pew beneath him loud in the silence of the church. He crossed to the altar, where a small wooden box sat in the shadows, its surface scarred from years of being moved from one hiding place to another. He opened it, revealing the only piece of his past he hadn't been able to destroy, his old deputy's badge. Its star dulled by time, but heavy with memory. Beside it, a single bullet, its casing etched with Abigail's initials, a reminder of the cost of trust. He hadn't touched it in years, but tonight, his fingers brushed against it, cold and unyielding. Like the truth, the door to the church creaked open, and Jonah spun, hand dropping to the revolver he still carried beneath his coat. The figure in the doorway was no stranger, though. It was Caleb, the boy who wasn't really a boy anymore, all of 17, lanky and sharp-eyed, with a mop of brown hair and a stubborn streak that reminded Jonah too much of himself. Caleb had been coming to the church for years, ever since Jonah had found him half-starved in an alley, stealing bread to survive. He'd taken the kid in, not out of kindness, but because he couldn't stand to see another life chewed up by the world's cruelty. Caleb had become something like a friend, though Jonah would never admit it. The kid had a knack for showing up when he was least wanted, but most needed. "Preacher," Caleb said, stepping inside, his boots leaving faint prints of red dust on the floor. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Jonah muttered, folding the note and tucking it into his pocket. He didn't want Caleb involved in this. The kid had enough scarce literal and otherwise without adding Jonah's past to the tally. "What are you doing here, Caleb?" "It's late." Caleb shrugged, leaning against a pew with a casualness that didn't quite hide the worry in his eyes. "Heard something in town. Folks saying there's been trouble up in Red Hollow. A man gutted out in the open, left with a note pinned to his chest. Thought you'd want to know." Jonah's blood went cold, but he kept his face steady. "Heard about it. Nothing to do with us." Caleb raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "You sure? 'Cause the way folks talk, it sounds like someone's sending a message. And you're the only one I know who gets messages from dead men." Jonah didn't answer. He didn't need to. Caleb had a way of seeing through his silences, reading the truth in the lines of his face. The kid had grown up in the shadow of men like Jonah, who carried their pasts like chains. He'd learned to spot the signs of trouble, and Jonah knew he couldn't hide this forever. "Go home, Caleb," Jonah said, his voice softer than he meant it to be. "This ain't your fight." "Maybe not," Caleb replied, crossing his arms. "But I'm not leaving you to face it alone. You taught me better than that." Jonah wanted to argue, to send the kid away, but the truth was, Caleb was already into deep. He'd been there the day Jonah had stumbled into this town, half dead from exhaustion and grief, and he'd stuck around through every sermon, every late-night talk about the stars and the sins they couldn't outrun. Caleb wasn't family, but he was the closest thing Jonah had to it, and that was a dangerous thing to admit. The night passed in uneasy quiet, Jonah sitting by the lantern, Caleb sprawled across the pews, pretending to sleep but watching the door. Dawn came slow, the sky turning from black to gray, the air heavy with the promise of heat. Jonah didn't sleep. He couldn't. The note was a weight in his pocket, a ticking clock he couldn't silence. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the church's cracked windows, he made a decision. He couldn't wait for Elias to come to him. Not this time. "Caleb," he said, standing and grabbing his coat. "Get your horse." The kid sat up, blinking away the pretense of sleep. "Where we goin'?" "Red Hollow," Jonah said, checking his revolver with a practiced flick of his wrist. "We're gonna find out who left that body, and why my name was on it." The ride to Red Hollow was a brutal one, the sun climbing high and turning the desert into a furnace. Jonah's horse, a sturdy bay named Ruth, moved with a steady rhythm, her hooves kicking up clouds of dust that stung his eyes. Caleb rode beside him, his own horsey a scrappy gelding he called trouble keeping pace despite the heat. The boy didn't complain, though Jonah could see the sweat beading on his brow, the way his hands tightened on the reins when they passed the first signs of trouble. Vultures circling over a distant rise, their wings cutting sharp arcs against the sky. Red Hollow was a ghost town, or near enough. Once a bustling hub for miners chasing silver, it had withered when the veins ran dry, leaving behind crumbling saloons, a boarded-up general store, and a cemetery with more graves than living souls. The air here was thick with the scent of decay, not just the earth, but the dreams of men who'd thought they'd strike it rich. Jonah hated this place. It reminded him too much of Copper Creek, of the life he'd left behind. They found the body just outside town, half buried in a shallow ditch, the sand already trying to claim it. The man was young, maybe 30, his face frozen in a grimace of pain. His shirt was torn open, the stab wounds in his chest dark and crusted with blood. The vultures had been at him, but not enough to hide the truth. This wasn't a robbery or a bar fight gone wrong. This was personal. A message, just like the stranger had said. Caleb dismounted, crouching beside the body with a frown. "Know him?" Jonah shook his head, studying the man's face. He was a stranger, his features unremarkable save for the terror etched into them. But the way he'd been killed had multiple stab wounds. Precise and deliberate. Told Jonah this wasn't random. He reached down, brushing sand from the man's chest, and found the spot where the note had been pinned. The paper was gone, delivered to Jonah's doorstep, but the puncture mark remained, a small, cruel signature. "Looks like someone wanted him to suffer," Caleb said, his voice low. "This ain't just a killing, it's a warning." Jonah nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. The desert was silent, but it was a lying kind of silence, the kind that hid predators. "Whoever did this knew I'd come looking," he said. "They wanted me here." Caleb stood, wiping his hands on his pants. "Then why leave the note? Why not just come for you?" "Because Elias doesn't work that way." The name slipped out before Jonah could stop it, and Caleb's eyes sharpened. "Elias, as in Elias Kane? The guy who—" "Don't," Jonah cut him off, his voice sharp. "Not now." Caleb held up his hands, backing off, but the questions were there, unspoken, hanging between them like smoke. Jonah turned away, walking the perimeter of the scene, looking for tracks, signs, anything that might tell him more. The sand was too dry, too loose to hold much, but he found a single boot print, half erased by the wind. It was deep, deliberate, like someone had stood here, watching the man die. "We need to move," Jonah said, mounting Ruth. "Whoever did this might still be close." Caleb didn't argue, swinging onto Trouble's back with a fluid grace that belied his youth. They rode into Red Hollow, the town's empty streets swallowing the sound of their horses' hooves. The saloon was the only place still standing that might hold answers. Its doors hung crooked, but the bar inside was intact, the air heavy with the ghosts of spilled whiskey and broken promises. The bartender was an old man, his face lined like the desert itself, his eyes wary as Jonah, and Caleb stepped inside. "Don't get many visitors," he said, pouring a glass of something that smelled like it could strip paint. "What brings you?" "Heard about a body outside town," Jonah said, keeping his voice neutral. "Know anything about it?" The bartender's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Jonah. "Folks around here don't talk much. Bad for business, worse for living." Jonah slid a coin across the bar, its clink loud in the quiet. "I'm not folks." The old man pocketed the coin, leaning closer. "Heard it was one of Kane's men. A runner, maybe, carrying something he shouldn't have. Word is, Kane's back in the territory. Got a new crew, new money, and he's looking for someone. Didn't catch a name." Jonah's jaw tightened, but he kept his face blank. "Where's Kane now?" The bartender shrugged. "No one knows. Or if they do, they ain't talking. Men like Kane don't stay in one place long. But if he's here, you'd best watch your back. Preacher. He don't forget a grudge." Jonah didn't need the warning. He'd known Elias long enough to understand the man's patience, the way he'd wait years to settle a score. The note wasn't just a threat, it was a summons, a call to finish what they'd started a decade ago. They left the saloon, the heat pressing down like a fist. Caleb was quiet, but Jonah could feel the kid's questions piling up, ready to spill over. "Don't ask," Jonah said before Caleb could open his mouth. "Not yet." Caleb nodded, but his eyes were sharp, watching Jonah like he was waiting for him to crack. They rode back toward the church, the desert stretching endless around them, the weight of the note heavier with every mile. Jonah knew this wasn't the end. Elias Kane wasn't a man who left loose ends, and Jonah was the loose end of all. As they neared the church, a shadow moved on the ridge above a rider, too far to make out, but close enough to send a chill down Jonah's spine. He didn't draw his gun, didn't need to. The message had been delivered, and the hunt was on. The rider on the ridge didn't move. He sat still as stone, a dark silhouette against the bruised purple of the evening sky, his horse a shadow carved from the same darkness. Jonah's hand rested on his revolver, not drawing but ready, his eyes locked on the figure. Beside him, Caleb shifted in his saddle, Trouble snorting softly as if sensing the tension coiling in the air. The desert was silent, but it was the kind of silence that screamed danger, the kind that came before a storm or a gunshot. "Friend of yours?" Caleb whispered, his voice low but steady, his hand hovering near the knife strapped to his belt. The kid had no gun. Jonah had made sure of that years ago, not wanting to see another young life shaped by the weight of a trigger. But Caleb's eyes were sharp, scanning the ridge for movement, for any sign of what came next. Not likely, Jonah murmured, his voice rough as the sand underfoot. He squinted, trying to make out details, but the distance and the fading light made it impossible. The rider wasn't advancing, wasn't retreating, just watching, like a predator sizing up its prey. Jonah's gut told him this was no coincidence. The note, the body in Red Hollow, the whispers of Elias Kane's return. This rider was part of it, a piece of the puzzle Jonah hadn't yet figured out how to fit. "Stay here," Jonah said, nudging Ruth forward. "If I signal, you ride back to the church and don't stop." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he nodded, his fingers curling around trouble's reins. "Don't do anything stupid, preacher." Jonah didn't answer. Stupid was a luxury he couldn't afford, not anymore. He urged Ruth into a slow walk, keeping his eyes on the rider, his body tense but controlled. The ridge was a jagged line of rock and scrub, offering plenty of cover for an ambush. If this was Elias or one of his men, Jonah knew he was walking into a trap. But waiting for trouble to come to him had never been his way, not even in the years he'd spent trying to forget who he was. Halfway up the slope, the rider moved, not toward Jonah, but away, turning his horse with a fluid motion and disappearing over the crest of the ridge. The suddenness of it caught Jonah off guard, his hand tightening on the revolver as he spurred Ruth to follow. The mare's hooves churned the loose earth, kicking up dust that stung his eyes, but he didn't slow. He crested the ridge just in time to see the rider vanish into a narrow canyon, the walls of red rock swallowing him like a secret. Jonah pulled Ruth to a stop, his breath coming hard, not from exertion, but from the weight of what he was chasing. The canyon was a death trap, tight, shadowed, with too many places for a man to hide and too few for Jonah to maneuver. He could feel the note in his pocket, Jonah Cade, soon burning like a brand against his skin. This was what Elias wanted, to draw him out, to make him reckless, to pull him back into the game they'd played 10 years ago. And Jonah was falling for it, step by step. He turned back, signaling Caleb to join him. The kid rode up quickly, his face a mix of relief and frustration. "Lost him. For now," Jonah said, his eyes still scanning the canyon's mouth. "But he wanted us to see him, wanted us to know he's out there." Caleb frowned, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You think it's Kane?" Jonah didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. The name hung between them, heavy as the heat pressing down on the desert. Instead, he turned Ruth back toward the church, his mind racing. The rider hadn't attacked, hadn't spoken, just watched and vanished. It was a move straight out of Elias's playbook: unsettle, provoke, control the board before the first shot was fired. But Jonah wasn't the same man he'd been 10 years ago. He wasn't a deputy anymore, wasn't a husband, wasn't even sure he was a preacher. What he was, though, was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of letting the past dictate his future. "We need to get back," Jonah said. "And we need to be ready." "For what?" Caleb asked, his voice edged with the kind of curiosity that could get a man killed. "For whatever's coming," Jonah replied, and kicked Ruth into a trot. The church was dark when they returned. The lantern Jonah had left burning now, just a faint glow in the window. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and older regrets. Jonah lit a second lantern, its light casting long shadows across the pews, and set to work. He didn't know how much time they had, but he wasn't going to waste it. From the wooden box on the altar, he pulled a map of the territory, yellowed and creased from years of disuse. It was a relic from his deputy days, marked with trails, hideouts, and safe houses he'd once known like the back of his hand. Caleb watched in silence as Jonah spread the map across the altar, his fingers tracing the lines of canyons and rivers that snaked through the desert. "You're planning something," the kid said, not a question but a statement. "Planning to survive," Jonah corrected, his voice low. "Elias Kane doesn't leave notes unless he's already got a noose around your neck. If he's back, he's got men, money, and a reason. We need to know what that reason is before he makes his move." Caleb leaned over the map, his eyes narrowing. "Red Hollow's here," he said, pointing to a small dot near the edge of the territory. "If Kane's men are operating there, They're not far from Blackwater Canyon. That's where the old smuggling routes run. Used to be a favorite for outlaws before the law cracked down. Jonah's lips twitched, a rare flicker of pride cutting through his grim mood. The kid had a sharp mind, sharper than most gave him credit for. "You've been paying attention," he said. Caleb shrugged, a grin tugging at his mouth. "Had a good teacher." The moment of levity didn't last. A sound outside a sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot made them both freeze. Jonah's hand was on his revolver before he could think, his body moving on instinct honed by years of danger. Caleb reached for his knife, his eyes darting to the door. The church was isolated, miles from the nearest town, but that didn't mean they were alone. Not tonight. Jonah motioned for Caleb to stay low and crept toward the window, keeping to the shadows. The night outside was still, the stars bright and cold, but there was movement near the edge of the property, a flicker of something that wasn't wind or wildlife. He squinted, his heart thudding against his ribs, and saw it, a figure, low to the ground, moving toward the church with the careful steps of someone who didn't want to be seen. "Caleb," Jonah whispered, not taking his eyes off the window. "Back door." Now. The kid didn't hesitate, slipping toward the rear of the church where a narrow door led to the scrubland behind. Jonah followed, his revolver drawn, his senses sharp. They stepped outside, the night air cool against their skin, and moved silently along the wall, keeping the church's bulk between them and the intruder. The figure was closer now, crouched near the front steps, a dark shape that could have been a man or a ghost. Jonah raised his revolver, his voice cutting through the silence like a whip. "Show yourself." Slow. The figure froze, hands rising in a gesture of surrender. "Don't shoot," a voice called, low and hoarse, with a tremor that spoke of fear or exhaustion. "I'm not here to hurt you." Jonah stepped forward, keeping the revolver trained on the figure. "Step into the light. Hands where I can see 'em." The figure obeyed, moving into the faint glow spilling from the church's window. It was a woman, her face pale and streaked with dirt, her clothes torn and stained with what looked like blood. Her hair, dark and tangled, fell across her shoulders, and her eyes wide and green, like the sagebrush after rain, locked onto Jonah's with a mix of desperation and defiance. She was young, maybe 25, but her posture carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much, too fast. "Who are you?" Jonah demanded, his grip on the revolver steady, but his mind racing. The last time a stranger had shown up at his door, it had been with a note that promised death. This woman didn't look like one of Elias's men, but looks could lie, and Jonah had learned that lesson the hard way. "My name's Leela," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Leela Harper. I need your help, preacher. They're after me." "Who's after you?" Caleb asked, stepping out from behind Jonah, his knife still in hand but lowered. Lila's eyes flicked to Caleb, then back to Jonah, as if weighing whether she could trust them. "Men from Red Hollow. Men who work for Elias Kane." The name hit Jonah like a punch, but he didn't flinch. He lowered the revolver slightly, just enough to show he wasn't about to shoot, but kept it ready. "Why you running from Kane?" Lila's jaw tightened, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "Because I know what he's planning, and because I took something from him he wants back." Jonah's eyes narrowed. "What did you take?" She hesitated, then reached into her coat, moving slowly to avoid spooking him. She pulled out a small leather pouch, its surface worn but intact. "This," she said, tossing it at Jonah's feet. It landed with a soft thud, a faint metallic clink echoing in the night. Jonah didn't move to pick it up. "What's in it?" "Proof," Leela said, her voice steady now, though her hands were still trembling. "Proof that Kane's been running guns and opium through Blackwater Canyon. Names, dates, routes, everything you need to bring him down. I was his bookkeeper, kept his ledgers clean for the law. But I saw too much, heard too much. When I tried to leave, he sent his men to make sure I didn't talk." Jonah's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her story. A bookkeeper for Elias Kane wasn't just a clerk to have been deep in his world, close enough to know his secrets, close enough to be dangerous. And if she was telling the truth, that pouch was a death sentence, for her and anyone who touched it. "Why come to me?" Jonah asked, his voice low, almost a growl. "You don't know me." Lila's eyes met his, unflinching despite the fear in them. "I know you, Jonah Cade. I know you were a deputy in Copper Creek. I know what Elias did to Udo, your wife. And I know you're the only man in this territory who's got a reason to hate him as much as I do." The mention of Abigail was a knife to the gut, but Jonah kept his face blank, his years of practice holding him together. Caleb, though, wasn't as restrained. "You're saying you want the preacher to take on Elias Kane? You got any idea what that means?" "I know exactly what it means," Leela snapped, her voice rising. "It means blood and death, and maybe a chance to stop a man who's been killing and stealing for years, without anyone touching him. I didn't come here because I thought it'd be easy. I came here because I thought you'd understand." Jonah studied her, searching for the lie, for the trap, but all he saw was a woman on the edge, running from a monster he knew too well. He bent down, picked up the pouch, and opened it. Inside was a small notebook, its pages filled with tight, precise handwriting numbers, locations, all meticulously recorded. He recognized some of the names, men who'd been untouchable in Copper Creek, men who'd walked free while Abigail's blood stained the street. If this was real, it was dynamite. If it was a trick, it was a damn good one. "Get inside," Jonah said, jerking his head toward the church. "We'll talk there." Leela hesitated, then nodded, stepping past him toward the door. Caleb followed, his knife still in hand, his eyes darting between Jonah and the woman. Jonah lingered outside for a moment, scanning the darkness. The rider on the ridge, the body in Red Hollow, Lila's sudden appearance site was all connected. A web Elias was weaving to pull Jonah back into his world. And Jonah was starting to realize he might not have a choice but to play along. Inside the church, the air was heavy with tension. Leela sat on a pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the lantern light casting shadows across her face. Jonah stood by the altar, the notebook open in his hands, his eyes scanning the pages. Caleb leaned against the wall, watching Leela like she might sprout claws at any moment. The kid's instincts were good, but Jonah could see he was Tornhof wanting to trust her, half ready to bolt. "This is real," Jonah said finally, closing the notebook. "Names, dates, shipments, it's all here. Enough to put Kane away for good, if it gets to the right hands." Leela nodded, her shoulders sagging slightly, as if the weight of carrying that truth had been crushing her. "I didn't want to be part of it," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I took the job because I needed the money. My brother was sick, needed medicine we couldn't afford. Kane offered me work, said it was just bookkeeping, nothing dirty. But then I started seeing the patterns, the money that didn't add up, the men who came and went in the night. I started copying the ledgers, keeping my own records. When I realized what he was doing, I knew I had to get out. And he didn't take kindly to that," Jonah said, his voice flat, but his eyes sharp. Lila's laugh was bitter, like broken glass. "He put a knife to my throat, told me I'd never leave unless it was in a box. I got away, barely. Been running ever since. Found out he was looking for you, preacher. Heard your name in his camp. Heard him say you were the one loose and he couldn't let stand." Jonah's jaw tightened. He'd known this was coming, had felt it in his bones the moment he'd seen that note. But hearing it from Leela made it real, made the past a living thing that could reach out and choke him. "What does he want with me?" "Revenge," Leela said simply. "You walked away from Copper Creek, humiliated him by surviving when he thought he'd broken you. He's built an empire since then, but he's never forgotten you. That note, it's not just a threat, it's an invitation. He wants you to come to him." Caleb pushed off the wall, his voice sharp. "So what, we just sit here and wait for him to show up? Or we ride into Blackwater Canyon and get ourselves killed?" Jonah didn't answer right away. He set the notebook on the altar, beside the badge and the bullet, and stared at them, the relics of a life he'd tried to bury. Lila's story rang true, but trust was a currency he'd spent long ago. Still, the notebook was real, and so was the rider on the ridge. Elias was moving, and Jonah couldn't afford to stand still. "We don't wait," Jonah said finally. "And we don't ride into a trap. We take this to someone who can use it." "Who?" Leela asked, her voice edged with hope and doubt. "The law around here's bought and paid for. You know that better than anyone." "Not all of it," Jonah said, thinking of a name he hadn't spoken in years. There's a federal marshal in Carson City, name of Amos Reed. He was a friend, back in the day. If he's still half the man he was, he'll listen." Caleb's eyes widened. "Carson City's 3 days' ride, preacher. Through Kane's territory. You really think we can make it with that notebook and not get caught?" "We don't have a choice," Jonah said, his voice hard. "If we stay here, Kane finds us. If we run without a plan, he finds us. This notebook's the only leverage we've got. We move fast, we move quiet, and we get it to read." Leela stood, her face set with determination. "I'm coming with you." "No," Jonah said, his tone final. "You're a target. You stay here, out of sight." "Like hell," Leela snapped, stepping closer, her green eyes flashing. "That notebook's my life's work, my proof that I didn't just roll over for Kane. I'm not sitting in this church waiting for his men to find me. I'm coming, preacher, whether you like it or not." Jonah stared at her, weighing her resolve against the danger. She was stubborn, reckless, but there was steel in her, the kind that didn't bend easily. He glanced at Caleb, who gave a slight nod, as if to say he'd back Jonah's call, whatever it was. "Fine," Jonah said at last, "but you do what I say, when I say it. No arguments." Leela nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. "No arguments." Caleb snorted. "That'll be the day." They left at dawn, the three of them riding hard across the desert, the church fading into the haze behind them. Jonah led the way on Ruth, Leela on a spare mare from the church's lean-to, and Caleb bringing up the rear on Trouble. The notebook was tucked inside Jonah's coat, a weight heavier than any gun. The sun climbed fast, turning the sand into a shimmering mirror that burned their eyes. But Jonah didn't slow. Every mile they put between them and the church was a mile closer to safety or to a reckoning. The first sign of trouble came on the second day. As they crossed a dry riverbed lined with twisted cottonwoods, Jonah spotted it first, a glint of metal in the distance, too sharp to be natural. He raised a hand, signaling a stop, and dismounted, motioning for Leela and Caleb to do the same. They led the horses into the shade of the trees, crouching low as Jonah scanned the horizon. "Riders," he said, his voice low. 3, maybe 4, coming from the east. Lila's face paled, but she didn't panic. "Kane's men, likely," Jonah said, checking his revolver. "Stay here. Keep the horses quiet." Caleb grabbed his arm, his voice urgent. "You can't take on 4 men alone, preacher." "I'm not fighting," Jonah said. "I'm scouting. If it's Kane's men, we need to know how close they are. How many? You stay with Leela. Protect that notebook." Caleb didn't like it, but he nodded, his knife already in hand. Lila's eyes followed Jonah as he slipped through the trees, moving like a man who'd spent years learning to be invisible. The riverbed was a maze of shadows and dry brush, perfect for cover, but also for ambush. Jonah's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the clarity that came before action, the kind that had kept him alive through 100 fights. He reached a low rise, peering over the edge. For riders, just as he'd thought, their horses kicking up dust as they moved with purpose. They weren't searching, they were tracking, their eyes fixed on the ground, following signs Jonah hadn't had time to cover. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, carried a rifle slung across his back, its barrel catching the sun. Jonah recognized the type, hired muscle, loyal to money and nothing else. But the man leading them was differential, lean, with a black coat and a hat pulled low. Something about the way he moved, the way he scanned the terrain, sent a chill through Jonah. Not Elias, but someone close to him, someone dangerous. Jonah slipped back to the others, his face grim. "They're tracking us," he said. "We can't outrun them, not with 3 horses and no cover for miles." Lila's hands clenched into fists. "What do we do?" Jonah looked at the riverbed, the trees, the narrow path leading deeper into the canyon beyond. "We set a trap," he said. "Draw them in, take them out quiet. If we're lucky, they won't know we're here until it's too late." Caleb's eyes widened, but he nodded, a spark of excitement cutting through his fear. "What's the plan?" Jonah outlined it quickly, used the riverbed's natural cover to lure the riders into a choke point, where Jonah could take them out one by one. Leela would stay hidden with the notebook, ready to run if things went south. Caleb would be the bait, drawing their attention with a false trail. It was risky, but it was their only shot. They moved fast, setting up in the shadow of a massive cottonwood, its gnarled branches offering just enough cover. Caleb scattered some broken twigs and scuffed the dirt to mimic a hasty retreat, then took position behind a boulder, his knife ready. Leela crouched in a shallow ditch, the notebook clutched to her chest, her eyes wide but steady. Jonah climbed a low ledge, his revolver in one hand, a length of rope in the Aethera trick from his deputy days, one he hadn't used in years. The riders came into view, moving slower now, cautious. The scarred man was in front, his rifle unslung, his eyes scanning the ground. The leader in the black coat rode behind, his posture relaxed, but his hand never far from his gun. Jonah waited, his breath steady, counting the seconds until they reached the choke point. Caleb moved first, darting across the riverbed just long enough to be seen, then vanishing into the brush. The scarred man shouted, pointing, and the riders spurred their horses forward, falling for the bait. Jonah waited until they were in the narrowest part of the riverbed, then dropped the rope, rigged to a branch he'd loosened earlier. It snapped down, startling the horses and sending the scarred man tumbling from his saddle. Jonah was on him in an instant, his revolver pressed to the man's temple. "Don't move," he growled, his voice low and deadly. The other riders froze, their hands hovering over their weapons. But the man in the black coat raised a hand, signaling them to stand down. "You're a hard man to find, Jonah Cade," the leader said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "Elias said you'd be trouble." Jonah's blood ran cold, but he didn't waver. "Who are you?" "Name's Silas," the man said, tipping his hat slightly. "Elias's right hand, you might say. He sent me to deliver a message. You can't run forever. Hand over the girl and the notebook, and maybe you walk away." "Not happening," Jonah said, pressing the revolver harder against the scarred man's head. "Tell your men to drop their weapons." Silas smiled, a predator's smile. "You're outnumbered, preacher, and outgunned. You really want to die here?" Jonah didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sound of Caleb's knife whizzing through the air did it for him, catching one of the riders in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground. Chaos erupted, the remaining riders drawing their guns, but Jonah was faster, firing twice and dropping to men before they could aim. Silas spurred his horse, charging toward the canyon, but Jonah was already moving, tackling the scarred man to the ground and using him as a shield. The fight was over in seconds, the riverbed littered with bodies, the air thick with gunpowder and dust. Silas was gone, his horse's hoof beats fading into the distance. Jonah stood, his chest heaving, his revolver still warm in his hand. Caleb emerged from the brush, his knife bloody, but his face pale. Leela climbed out of the ditch, her eyes wide with shock, but her grip on the notebook steady. "You hurt?" Jonah asked, his voice rough. Caleb shook his head, wiping his knife on his pants. "I'm good. You?" Jonah didn't answer. He was staring at the scarred man, still alive, groaning in the dirt. Jonah knelt beside him, grabbing his collar. "Where's Silas headed?" The man spat blood, his eyes defiant. "You're dead, preacher. You and the girl. Elias'll make sure of it." Jonah pressed the revolver to the man's forehead. "Answer the question." The man laughed, a wet, choking sound. "Blackwater Canyon, where it all ends." Jonah stood, letting the man slump back to the ground. He didn't need to ask what that meant. Blackwater Canyon was where Elias operated, where the smuggling routes converged, where the notebook's secrets would either save them or bury them. He turned to Leela and Caleb, their faces lit by the dying sun, and saw the same resolve he felt in his own chest. "We ride for Carson City," Jonah said. "But first, we need to know what we're walking into. Blackwater's our next stop." Leela nodded, her jaw set. "I'm ready." Caleb grinned, though it was more bravado than bravery. "Let's go hunting." Jonah didn't smile. He was done running, done hiding. Elias Kane wanted a reckoning, and Jonah was ready to give him one. But as they mounted their horses and rode into the darkening canyon, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a traponi. That might cost them more than their lives. The canyon walls rose like sentinels, their red stone jagged and unyielding, swallowing the sound of the horses' hooves as Jonah, Caleb, and Leela rode deeper into Blackwater Canyon. The air was thick with the scent of dust and iron, the kind of smell that clung to your skin and reminded you of blood. The sun was gone, hidden behind the towering cliffs, leaving only a thin strip of twilight sky above, bruised purple and streaked with clouds that looked like they'd been torn apart. Jonah rode in front, his eyes scanning every shadow, every crevice. His revolver a familiar weight at his hip. The notebook in his coat felt heavier, its pages a map to a confrontation he'd spent 10 years avoiding. Caleb rode beside him, his usual chatter silenced by the weight of what lay ahead. Trouble's ears flicked nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Leela brought up the rear, her mare stepping carefully over the uneven ground, her face set in a mask of determination that didn't quite hide the fear in her green eyes. The riverbed fight had shaken her, but she hadn't broken, and Jonah respected that, even if he didn't trust her completely. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with Elias Kane's shadow looming closer with every step. "Slow," Jonah said, raising a hand as they approached a bend in the canyon. The path narrowed here, the walls closing in until there was barely room for 2 horses abreast. It was a perfect spot for an ambush, and Jonah's instinct screamed that Silas hadn't fled the riverbed by chance. He'd led them here, to Blackwater, where Elias held court like a king in a kingdom of stone and sin. Caleb reigned in trouble, his knife already in hand, his eyes darting to the cliffs above. "You see something, preacher?" "Not yet," Jonah said, his voice low, "but it's coming." Leela dismounted, tying her mare to a gnarled juniper that clung to the canyon wall. "This is it," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Kane's camp is just beyond the next rise. I've seen it tents, crates, men armed to the teeth. If he's here, this is where he'll be." Jonah nodded, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. "You sure about that notebook, Leela? If it's what you say, Kane won't let us walk out of here alive." "It's real," she said, meeting his gaze. "And it's all we've got." Caleb snorted, but there was no humor in it. "Great. So we're walking into a hornet's nest with a book and a prayer. You got a plan, preacher, or we just hoping for a miracle?" Jonah's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. "Plan's simple. We find Kane, we get the notebook to Marshall Reed, and we don't die." "Real inspiring," Caleb muttered, but he followed as Jonah dismounted and led them forward on foot, keeping low and using the canyon's shadows for cover. The air grew colder as they moved deeper, the walls seeming to lean in, watching. Jonah's heart beat steady, but his mind was a storm of memory. Sabigil's laughter, Elias's betrayal, the sound of a gunshot that had changed everything. He pushed them down, focusing on the present, on the weight of the revolver in his hand, and the lives depending on him. They reached the rise, a low shelf of rock overlooking a wide basin where the canyon opened up. Below, just as Leela had said, was Kane's camp, a cluster of canvas tents, crates stacked high, and men moving like ants in the flickering light of torches. Jonah counted at least a dozen, all armed, their rifles glinting as they patrolled the perimeter. At the center of the camp stood a larger tent, its entrance flanked by 2 men with shotguns, their faces hard and unyielding. That was where Elias would be, if he was here at all. "Too many," Caleb whispered, crouching beside Jonah. "We can't take 'em all." "We don't have to," Jonah said. "We just need to get close enough to confirm Kane's here. Then we slip out and ride for Carson City." Lila's eyes narrowed. "And if he's not here? If this is another trap?" "Then we deal with it," Jonah said, his voice hard. "But we don't turn back." She nodded, her jaw tight, and Jonah saw something in her that reminded him of Abigail, not her face, but her fire, the kind that burned even when the world tried to snuff it out. He shook the thought away, focusing on the camp below. The notebook was their leverage, but only if they could get it to read before Kane's men got to them. And that meant moving now, before the camp woke to their presence. Jonah led them down a narrow path that hugged the canyon wall, their steps silent against the soft sand. The torches below cast long shadows, giving them cover as they approached the camp's edge. Jonah's plan was to skirt the perimeter, get a look inside the main tent, and retreat without being seen. But plans, he knew, had a way of falling apart. They were halfway to the camp when a shout cut through the night, sharp and urgent. Jonah froze, his hand on his revolver, as a figure emerged from the Shadowsa boy. No older than Caleb, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He was running, stumbling over the uneven ground, a rifle clutched awkwardly in his hands. Behind him, two men gave chase, their boots pounding the dirt, their voices rough with anger. "Stop him," one of them shouted, and Jonah realized the boy wasn't one of Cain's men who was running from them. Caleb moved before Jonah could stop him, darting out to grab the boy and pull him into the shadows. The kid struggled, swinging the rifle wildly, but Caleb was stronger, pinning him down with a whispered, "Quiet, or we're all dead." Jonah cursed under his breath, motioning for Leela to stay low. The two pursuers were close now, their lanterns casting pools of light that crept toward their hiding spot. Jonah gripped his revolver, his mind racing. They couldn't afford a fight, not here, not now, but the boy's presence changed everything. "Who are you?" Jonah hissed, keeping his voice low as he crouched beside the boy. The kid's eyes were wild, his breath coming in short gasps. "Tommy," he stammered. "Tommy Webb. They took my sister. Said she'd work off my debt. I tried to get her out, but—" "Quiet," Jonah snapped, his eyes on the approaching men. He could hear their voices now, low and menacing, as they scanned the darkness. Tommy's story hit too close to home, echoing Lila's own tale of escape. Cain's empire wasn't just guns and opium, it was built on people, on lives broken and traded like currency. Lila's face was pale, but her voice was steady. "We can't leave him." "We don't have a choice," Jonah said, though the words tasted like ash. "We take him, we're carrying a beacon for Cain's men to follow." Caleb's eyes flashed with defiance. "You're not leaving him, preacher. Not like this." Jonah met Caleb's gaze, seeing the stubborn resolve that had kept the kid alive through years of hardship. He wanted to argue, to tell Caleb this wasn't their fight, but the truth was, it had been his fight since the moment he'd read that note. Elias Kane wasn't just coming for him, was coming for everyone who'd ever crossed him, everyone who'd dared to stand in his way. "Fine," Jonah said, his voice low, "but we move now, and we move quiet." They pulled Tommy deeper into the shadows, the boy trembling, but following without protest. The pursuers were close, their lanterns sweeping the ground, their voices growing louder. Jonah led the group along the canyon wall, moving toward a cluster of boulders that offered better cover. But as they reached the rocks, a shot rang out, the bullet striking the stone above Jonah's head and sending shards of rock raining down. "Down," Jonah shouted, shoving Leela and Tommy behind a boulder as Caleb dropped to the ground. The pursuers had spotted them, their lanterns now fixed on the group's position. Jonah returned fire, his revolver barking twice, and one of the men fell, his lantern shattering and igniting a patch of dry brush. The camp erupted into chaos, shouts and footsteps echoing as more of Cain's men mobilized. Jonah's heart pounded, but his hands were steady, muscle memory from his deputy days taking over. "Caleb, take Tommy and Leela to the horses," he said, firing another shot to keep the pursuers at bay. "I'll cover you." "No way," Caleb said, his knife flashing as he prepared to fight. "We're not leaving you." "Do it," Jonah growled, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Get that notebook out of here." Leela grabbed Tommy's arm, pulling him toward the path they'd come from. Caleb hesitated, his eyes locked on Jonah's, but a nod from the preacher sent him running after them. Jonah turned back to the fight, his revolver steady as he took down another of Cain's men. The camp was alive now, torches moving like fireflies, men shouting orders as they closed in. Jonah ducked behind a boulder, reloading with practiced efficiency. He could hear the horses in the distance, Caleb and Leela making their escape, but the sound was drowned out by the thunder of boots approaching. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in a canyon with no easy way out. But he wasn't afraid. Fear had burned out of him years ago, replaced by something harder, something that kept him alive when everything else had tried to kill him. A shadow loomed to his left, and Jonah spun, firing before the man could raise his rifle. But another was already on him, a blade glinting in the torchlight. Jonah dodged, the knife grazing his arm, and drove his fist into the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. He didn't have time to check if the man was down for good. More were coming, their silhouettes dark against the flickering flames. And then he saw him, Elias Kane, standing at the edge of the camp, his black coat billowing in the canyon wind, his face lit by the glow of a torch. He wasn't smiling, wasn't gloating, just watching. His eyes locked on Jonah like a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. For a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them. The years falling away until it was Copper Creek again, Abigail's blood on the ground, Elias's betrayal cutting deeper than any bullet. "Jonah Cade," Elias called, his voice carrying over the chaos. "You should have stayed in your church." Jonah didn't answer. He raised his revolver, aiming for Elias's heart, but before he could fire, a shot rang out from behind, grazing his shoulder and sending him stumbling. He turned, firing blindly into the darkness, and heard a cry as one of Cain's men fell. But the distraction was Anagilia's was gone, vanishing into the camp like a ghost. Jonah cursed, his shoulder burning, blood soaking his coat. He couldn't stay here. He broke for the canyon wall, using the rocks for cover as he ran, bullets kicking up dirt around him. The horses were close now, their panicked whinnies cutting through the night. He reached the path where he'd left Ruth, finding Caleb, Leela, and Tommy already mounted, their faces pale but determined. "Move," Jonah shouted, swinging onto Ruth's back as another shot whizzed past his head. They spurred their horses, the canyon blurring around them as they rode hard for the open desert. The camp's torches faded behind them, but Jonah knew Elias wasn't done. He'd seen the look in his old partner's eyes, a promise that this wasn't over, that it wouldn't be over until one of them was dead. They rode through the night, the stars their only guide, the desert stretching endless and unforgiving. Jonah's shoulder throbbed, but he ignored it, focusing on the rhythm of Ruth's hooves, the weight of the notebook in his coat, the lives riding beside him. Caleb was quiet, his usual bravado replaced by a grim focus. Leela clutched the reins, her eyes scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. Tommy, barely able to stay in the saddle, clung to Caleb's spare horse, his face a mask of guilt and fear. They stopped at dawn, finding shelter in a shallow cave carved into a low cliff. Jonah dismounted, his shoulders stiff and aching, and checked the wound. It was shallow, the bullet having grazed the muscle, but it needed cleaning. Leela tore a strip from her shirt, her hands steady as she helped him bind it, her touch careful but firm. "You've done this before," Jonah said, his voice low. "Too many times," she replied, not meeting his eyes. "My brother, he got into fights. I learned to patch him up." Jonah nodded, understanding more than he said. Leela wasn't just a bookkeeper, she was a survivor, like him, like Caleb, like Tommy, who sat huddled against the cave wall, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Tell me about your sister," Jonah said, turning to the boy. "What's her name?" "Clara," Tommy said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's 16. Owed Kane money gambling debts. Kane said he'd forgive it if Clara worked for him. But she wasn't working. They were gonna sell her." Lila's hands froze, her face paling. Jonah saw the recognition in her eyes, the same horror he felt twisting in his gut. Kane's empire wasn't just guns and drugs, it was human lives, bought and sold like cattle. Abigail had died because of men like Kane, men who saw people as pawns, not souls. "We'll get her out," Jonah said, the words coming before he could stop them. He didn't know how, didn't know if it was possible. But he couldn't look at Tommy's face and say anything else. Caleb raised an eyebrow, his voice skeptical but soft. "You sure about that, preacher? We're barely keeping ourselves alive." "I'm sure," Jonah said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "We get to Carson City, we give Reed the notebook, and we come back for Clara." Lila's eyes met his, a flicker of gratitude in them, but also something else, hope, maybe, or trust. It was a dangerous thing, that trust, but Jonah couldn't deny it felt like something worth fighting for. The ride to Carson City took 2 more days, each one harder than the last. The desert was merciless, the heat sapping their strength, the constant threat of pursuit keeping them on edge. Jonah pushed them hard, knowing every hour brought Kane's men closer. Silas had escaped the riverbed, and Elias had seen Jonah in the camp. There was no hiding now, no running. The notebook was their only chance, and Marshal Amos Reed their only ally. Carson City was a sprawl of wood and brick, its streets bustling with miners, merchants, and men looking to make a quick fortune. Jonah led them to the marshal's office, a squat building at the edge of town. its windows dusty but intact. Reed was there, older than Jonah remembered, his hair gray but his eyes still sharp, the kind that saw through lies and didn't flinch from truth. "Jonah Cade," Reed said, rising from his desk as they entered. "Heard you were dead." "Not yet," Jonah said, pulling the notebook from his coat and setting it on the desk. "This is why." Reed's eyes narrowed as he opened the notebook, scanning the pages. "Kane," he said, the name a curse. "Been chasing him for years. Never could pin him down. This is enough to hang him, if it holds up." "It'll hold," Leela said, stepping forward. "I wrote it. Every name, every deal. I saw it all." Reed studied her, then Jonah, then Caleb and Tommy, who stood awkwardly by the door. "You're all in deep, aren't you?" "Deeper than you know," Jonah said. "Kane's got men after us, and he's got a girl to me's sister, Clara. We need to move fast." Reed nodded, his face grim. "I'll need time to get a posse together, get warrants. Kane's got friends in high-placed judges, sheriffs. This won't be clean." "Nothing about Kane is clean," Jonah said. "But we're not waiting. You take the notebook, do what you need to. We're going back for Clara." Reed's eyes softened, just for a moment. "You haven't changed, Jonah. Still trying to save everyone." "Not everyone," Jonah said, his voice quiet. "Just the ones I can." They left Carson City at dusk, armed with fresh supplies and a map Reed had given them, marked with the latest reports of Kane's movements. Blackwater Canyon was their destination, but Jonah knew it wouldn't be as simple as riding in and riding out. Kane would be ready, and this time, there'd be no running. The canyon was quieter when they returned, the camp's torches dimmed, the men fewer but more alert. Jonah led them to a high vantage point, overlooking the basin where Clara was likely held. Tommy's hands shook as he described her small, with red hair like their mother's, a girl who'd never deserved to be caught in Kane's web. "We go in quiet," Jonah said, his voice low. "Find Clara, get her out. No heroics." Caleb nodded, his knife ready. Lila's eyes were hard, her hand resting on the pistol Jonah had given her. Tommy, unarmed but determined, followed close behind. They slipped into the camp under cover of darkness, moving like ghosts among the tents. Jonah's heart pounded, but his hands were steady, his eyes scanning for any sign of Clara. They found her in a small tent at the camp's edge, her wrists bound, her face bruised but alive. Tommy choked back a sob as he cut her free, pulling her into his arms. But freedom was never that easy. A shout rang out, and the camp came alive, torches flaring, men drawing weapons. Jonah fired first, dropping a guard before he could raise his rifle. Caleb and Leela fought beside him, their movements desperate but precise, clearing a path to the horses. Elias Kane stepped out of the main tent, his face calm, his gun already drawn. "You're a stubborn man, Jonah," he said, his voice carrying over the chaos. "But you can't save them all." Jonah raised his revolver, his shoulder screaming with pain, but his aim true. "I don't have to," he said. "Just her." The shot was deafening, but it wasn't Jonah's. Silas, hidden in the shadows, fired from the side, the bullet catching Jonah in the chest. He staggered, blood blooming across his shirt, but he didn't fall. He fired back, his bullet finding Silas's heart, dropping him where he stood. Caleb grabbed Jonah, dragging him toward the horses as Leela and Tommy ran with Clara. Kane's men closed in, but the sound of hooves thundered from the canyon's mouth. Reed and his posse, arriving just in time. The fight was brutal, but it was over fast, Kane's men outmatched by the marshal's numbers. Elias vanished in the chaos, slipping into the canyon's shadows like he always did. Jonah collapsed against Ruth, his breath ragged, blood soaking his coat. Caleb's face was pale, his hands shaking as he tried to stop the bleeding. "Don't you die on me, preacher," he said, his voice breaking. Jonah managed a weak smile. "Not planning to." They made it out of Blackwater, Clara safe, the notebook in Reed's hands. Jonah survived, barely, the bullet missing his heart by inches. Carson City became their refuge, Reed's men guarding them as the marshal built his case against Kane. Clara and Tommy reunited, their bond stronger for the ordeal. Leela stayed, her knowledge of Kane's operations making her a key witness. Caleb never left Jonah's side, his loyalty a light in the darkness of their fight. But Jonah knew it wasn't over. Elias Kane was still out there, a shadow waiting to strike. The notebook had hurt him, but it hadn't killed him. And Jonah, scarred and healing, knew he'd face his old partner again. When that day came, he'd be readying it as a preacher, not as a deputy, but as a man who'd learned that some fights were worth dying for.